Hello and welcome back to JJ Painting. I am JJ and today we're going to be talking about the Imperial Guard. Oh, sorry, Astra Militarum. But you can understand why there's a bit of confusion there because this army is a bit of a venerable one. It's been around for a while, but we don't talk about it much these days and it seems to have disappeared off a lot of people's radar. And when we hear about people calling for new Eldar models, new Orc models, we don't hear that much talk about Guard getting a lot of new models. And the call for that seems to be almost as loud, but we don't seem to be getting anywhere with it, do we? Now, what I'm going to be doing today is talking a little bit about my perspective, a little bit of a history lesson for those of you who haven't been in the hobby that long, and we'll be going into all of that. So for today, we will be painting this classic metal Cadian officer from back in the day. It's a real blast from the past, this. It's metal for one thing. I'm sure some of you weren't even in the hobby when there were metal models around. That's just a sign of my age. Let's start with a quick history lesson, shall we? Up until about 2010, the Imperial Guard, as they were still known, really were the trailblazing army for 40k in a lot of ways. They had one of the largest product ranges in the Warhammer 40,000 canon. They were the first army to have a plastic super heavy in the Baneblade. They were the first army to have a plastic flyer in the Valkyrie. They had the largest share of Forge World product range as well in resin. Arguably, they still do, even with the Horus Heresy. And of course, they were the thing that put the Black Library novels on the map in the form of Caiaphas Cain, Gaunt's Ghosts, Colonel Schaefer's Last Chances, just to name a few. And the other thing to remember is that both in terms of the lore and everything else, no Imperial Guard, no Astra Militarum, no Imperium. As much as we do love the Space Marines and the Adeptus Sororitas and the Imperial Knights and the Titans, without the average lasman, doing his duty, keeping the line, you have no Imperium. So, in many ways, they are the lifeblood of the Imperium. And that's something which I think we really do need to remember. But, fast forward to today, 2020, and a lot of those glories have now faded. We don't hear much about the Astra Militarum. The amount of models they get in their range has trickled to being virtually negligible. And overall, we don't see a lot of them these days. What happened to get us here is the question. Why did this happen? So, how did we get here? Well, I've got a few answers to that question. So, the first thing, obviously, is the buy-in cost. There was an old joke going around when I started playing that if you could have one in any other army, the Imperial Guard could have a squadron of them. So, if you could have a tank, the Imperial Guard could have a squadron of them. If you could have a flyer or a walker, the Imperial Guard could have a squadron of them. If you wanted a squadron of infantry, the Imperial Guard could have a squadron of squadrons. And that's true, they used to be able to do that. And for those of you who weren't in the hobby 5-10 years ago, that sort of thing you don't see much anymore, but that was a thing they very much had. But obviously, that then makes them expensive. Now, even back in the day, there was definitely a price difference between an Imperial Guard army and a Space Marine army, because the difference straight away is they are very much a horde army. You take them in bucket loads of models, a bit like Orcs, a bit like Tyranids, even a bit like Eldar originally. But the difference between all of those armies and the Imperial Guard is that as time has gone by, those armies you can now have in smaller forces with a lower buy-in cost. So with Orcs, you have armies which are now more focused on knobs. With Eldar, you have things like the Wraith Guard models, and you can take armies that are largely bike-based, which are a bit smaller. And with Tyranids, you've got larger monsters now, which make smaller, more elite-focused armies. But with Imperial Guard, apart from their tank armies, tank brigades, which they've had for a while, in terms of infantry, there's no way that you can really bring down the cost. Nowadays, the price difference between 10 Space Marines and 10 Guardsmen isn't really that different. Now, in many ways, the Imperial Guard as an army have a similar problem to the fantasy armies back in the day before Age of Sigmar, where because the buying cost was so high, straight away that made it harder for new players to get into them because there was a massive upfront cost just to get a very basic level army, which in many ways could cost you far more than even an Imperial Knight army could do when you actually start comparing it points for points. And obviously, you run into problems from there because you're spending hundreds of pounds on hundreds of models, which take a very long time to paint, a very long time to build, and a very long time to play games with as well. I have an Imperial Guard army. My games were the longest with my Imperial Guard army, and I can tell you that was in its own kind of fun, but not necessarily for the people I was playing against. The second one is they do have a very big, very diverse range, but it's very dated. Now, one of the great things about Imperial Guard back in the day is that you could have Talon, you could have Cadian, you could have Kaschan, you could have Valhallan, Vostroyan, Death Corps of Krieg, Steel Legion. They had many, many different models for the same stat line, effectively. So infantry squads, guardsmen squads as they are now, there was so many different options, so many different ranges. For any other army, you did not have that. If you want a tactical squad, you can paint it differently, but at the core it's the same model. So you may paint it in Dark Angels or Blood Angels or Ultramarines or Imperial Fists, but it's still the same models. But Imperial Guard, you could have a completely different range of models that play by the same rules. Now, back then, that was a massive advantage, but the trouble is now that's a disadvantage, because Games Workshop have been able to focus more on the ranges which are a bit more ubiquitous and a bit more homogenous, because you can grow those out further. But when we look at things like Talon, Vostroyan, Valhallan, all of which I don't think have ever had a single new model since I started playing the hobby. I think these are all very much early 90s models. And the reason for that is because it's hard to keep those models up to date, especially seeing as many of them were metal and never made the transition to plastic. Now, knowing that straight away should tell us kind of where the priorities lie. Games Workshop have steadily and slowly made things for their Kaschan and Cadian lines, even though even then that's been quite a while since we've had any new models infantry-wise for them. But in terms of the other regiments, we've not seen anything like that. I imagine that when metal models began to become less popular and plastic began to take over, there was no real incentive for Games Workshop, and this is just speculation, purely speculation. Games Workshop had less of an incentive to bring their Imperial Guard metal range into plastic than they did to bring these smaller, more ubiquitous metal ranges for things like Space Marines, Orcs, and Chaos Marines into plastic. So as a result, what we have seen from the Imperial Guard over the past 10 years or so has largely been their vehicles, because the vehicles are more universal. If you're playing Kaschan, Cadian, Vostroyan, or Valhallan, then you will always have the same Leman Russ. A bit like if you're playing Imperial Fist, Dark Angel, Blood Angel, or Ultramarine, you'll always have the same tactical squad. That should be a really good indication for everyone involved where we are with the range. So this is why we have a diverse, like I said, but very dated range, because all of these things, they might have looked very nice at the time, but they're showing their age. It's very hard, I think, to attract new players. I would speculate as well that a lot of people that do buy things like the Steel Legion and the Vostroyans and the Mordians today are people who played the game back in the 90s and the early 2000s when these models were still relatively new, and as a result, these are the only people that are still buying them today. So this brings me on to my next point, and that is, in many ways, the Imperial Guard lack an identity of their own, the Astra Militarum. Now, I've been calling them the Imperial Guard this entire time for a reason. When I started playing, they were the Imperial Guard. I believe it was either 2013 or 2014 they changed the name to Astra Militarum. If I'm being honest, I don't mind the name change. A lot of people got a little bit huffy about it, which I can kind of understand, but I thought it was absolutely fine. You know, that's fine. But in terms of what that meant for the army, and going back to what I said about having all these wonderfully different diverse ranges, there was no single way to define the Imperial Guard. This is an academic point. Not one culture would ever be able to sum up humanity. When we think about it in terms of what this means for tabletop armies, it means that when you're trying to cultivate and update and add to a range of models that don't have quite the same homogenized effect, it's easy to see why Games Workshop have struggled to keep them updated and keep them in line with other armies. But as a result, it has led to this very sluggish decline in terms of what people see in terms of new and exciting models, and that in a way dates the range further. The only thing that hasn't happened to has been the Stormtroopers, or Tempestus Scions as they're called now. They're nice models, but again, it's a mix of their buy-in price is very high, they have their own identity, which is good for them, but they still only have a couple of kits, so they are still quite limited in terms of what you're bringing to the tabletop. Now, my last point is, I've said a lot about old models. I think this is a point which a lot of people might find contentious, but I think we need to mention it anyway, and that is, there are very few new ideas going into the Imperial Guard codexes as they come out. What we were seeing is migrations from Forge World into plastic. Now, in many ways, that's not a bad thing. A lot of the Forge World models still hold up nearly 20 years later. But where they do fall down is that because we've had those models for a very long time in resin, and now they're becoming plastic, we're not seeing any new additions really to the Imperial Guard range. So nothing brand new, nothing we've not seen before. But because that has been what Forge World have done, and Games Workshop have done in terms of migrating their range from resin to plastic, that has obviously left us going, where are the new ideas coming from? Now, there have been some exceptions. Balgrins were quite a nice thing, to be honest with you. Melee Ogrins, we haven't had those before. But that's what we have seen in terms of new ideas, which is, again, very minor when we think about the many variants of the Leman-Russ battle tank, the artillery tanks, and the stormtroopers going from resin to plastic. Now, those are nice, but that's all we've had. So, for me, this leaves the whole thing at a bit of a crossroads in terms of where do we go from here with the Astra Militarum. On the one hand, I don't think their entire range is dated enough that they need to do what they did to the Dark Eldar or the Genestealer cult, where they are removed from circulation and we have an entirely new range released to fit a completely new codex. Unless the Imperial Guard, Astra Militarum, are given their own unique way of playing, I think we will continue to see them decline. I don't believe they will ever disappear, but they definitely won't be as prominent as they once were in the Warhammer canon. And I think in terms of the history of Warhammer, that's a shame, and I personally would like to see them return to that point. And tell me what you think in the comments below. How do you feel about the Astra Militarum or the Imperial Guard? How do you feel about where they are now compared to how they were a few years ago? If you've never known any different, I'd be genuinely interested to hear your take on it and just to see how you have found them. So, that's my thoughts on the Imperial Guard, or the Astra Militarum as they are also known nowadays, and that is our officer there. I quite like the model. I think it's a bit of a shame that of all the metal models to go away, he was one of the ones to go, because he's got so much personality and I've always really liked him. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I hope that this little trip through history was cool for some of those of you who weren't there, and for those of you who remember it, it was a nice little trip down memory lane. But thank you so much again. Like, subscribe, hit the bell button, because that's the thing I need to say nowadays. I hope to see you on the next one, so goodbye and have a lovely day.